Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning risk management. Part 1. Risk management planning asks and answers these questions. What are the risks? How serious are they? And how can we tell? Which ones need to be actively managed? What shall we do to minimize or handle significant risks? Who should be involved? And who will be responsible? The Risk Management Knowledge Area's Planning Process Group includes 5 processes. Plan Risk Management, which has as its principal output the Risk Management Plan. Identify Risks, which has as its primary outputs the Risk Register and the Risk Report. Perform qualitative risk analysis, perform quantitative risk analysis, and plan risk responses. You notice that for these last 3 processes, I don't list any principal outputs. This is because the results of these processes, rather than being listed as separate outputs, are instead used to update the risk register and the risk report. All projects are risky. They're all trying to create something unique that will hopefully have certain benefits, and they're trying to do it with limited time, money, and resources. Project risk management aims to identify and manage risks that are not addressed by the other project management processes. This is an interesting perspective. If you think about it, all of project management is about managing risks. If projects weren't risky, they wouldn't need to be managed. Project management is risk management. The reason that there are other knowledge areas is because the management of risks in these other areas has matured to the point that there are standard best practices for them. Because projects are at risk for scope not being well understood or increasing out of control, we have standard processes, tools, and techniques and artifacts such as brainstorming, focus groups, requirements traceability matrices, work breakdown structures, and the scope baseline, as well as many others, to manage these risks, along with change and configuration management. Schedule risks are handled by following standard processes to generate standard outputs, such as network diagrams and Gantt charts. The same goes for all of the other knowledge areas of cost, quality, resources, and so on. Each knowledge area has the processes, tools, and techniques for managing the risks of that knowledge area. Risk management provides some general best practices for identifying and managing all of the other risks on the project that aren't already handled by one of the other knowledge areas. Next on the list of key concepts, we have individual versus overall project risk. This can be a little bit confusing. Individual risks are about specific risks, not specific individuals, but specific risks, one at a time. Overall project risk is the total effect of all of those individual project risks, plus other sources of uncertainty, such as those represented by the different ranges of estimates of activity durations, costs, and resource requirements. Next, we have positive versus negative risk. When we speak of risk in normal conversation, we're talking about negative risk, the things that could negatively impact something. However, the PMBOK guide also considers anything that could happen that could positively impact a project as a positive risk. The terminology doesn't make a lot of sense, but the approach to identifying and managing and maximizing the potential of such opportunities is so similar to the approach for negative risks that it does make sense to use the same processes, tools, techniques, and artifacts to manage opportunities. Finally, you need to be aware of the risk appetite and thresholds of your organization and key stakeholders, as this will drive how you analyze and respond to risks. The primary output of the plan risk management process is the risk management plan, which includes your risk strategy and your stakeholder risk appetite, the methodology that you're going to use in planning and managing risk, the timing of when you're going to do which risk management processes, the roles and responsibilities of the different people involved in risk management, who should be involved and what they should be doing, any funding requirements that you need in order to perform risk management. Also, your risk categories can be organized in a risk breakdown structure and included in your risk management plan. The definitions of your risk probabilities and impacts, which are then used in your probability and impact matrix. All of the reports for your risk register and risk report, for example, should be specified here. Also, all of the procedures that you should use for tracking, recording, and auditing all of your activities for risk management. As with virtually all of your planning processes, the project charter is at the top of the list of inputs to this plan risk management process. Not only is it a high-level document that is used in planning in all of these other knowledge areas, it specifically includes any high-level risks that have been identified that should now be included in your risk management planning. You'll also want to take a look at potentially all of the different components or subsidiary plans of your project management plan, because risk can come from anywhere, and how you manage your scope or your cost and your quality, your schedule, and so on can all affect how you need to manage your risks. You can also consult different project documents, but in particular, you have the stakeholder register that includes the stakeholders' roles and their risk appetites and tolerances for risk, which will definitely need to be included in your risk management planning. And of course, there are some enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. The PMBOK guide lists as enterprise environmental factors for this process the overall risk thresholds, not only of your organization, but of your key stakeholders. This is a pretty short list, and again, these lists are not meant to be comprehensive, but I would wonder, what about health, safety, and environmental regulations, standards, and guidelines? Wouldn't those also be valid enterprise environmental factors that should be considered in your risk management planning? For organizational process assets, we have a somewhat longer list. Your organization should have a risk policy that you should follow when it comes to managing your project. Hopefully, your organization will also have risk categories defined, including some basic risk breakdown structure templates that you can use. It should also include common definitions of risk concepts and terms. These are things such as the definitions of probability and impact that you should be using in your probability and impact matrices. You'll want to use these same definitions and templates so that you're consistent from project to project, and it's easier to work with key stakeholders in communicating and managing risk. Your organization may also have some predefined templates and formats for your risk statements, for your risk management plan, your risk register, and your risk report. You may also have, either in your organization, people who have roles and responsibilities surrounding risk, or at least some guidelines or policies about risk roles and responsibilities on projects in general. The authority levels for decision making, as well as information in your lessons learned repository about risks, previous projects, and so on, are also important inputs that can affect your risk management planning. Topping the list of our tools and techniques is expert judgment, as always. You should consult with your organization's experts who understand your organization's approach to risk and who are familiar with risks that they've seen on similar projects in the past. Under the category of data analysis, you have stakeholder analysis, in which you'll be assessing the risk appetite or tolerance of your key stakeholders. And then, of course, you'll have meetings with key stakeholders to help plan your risk management. And in these meetings, you may want to consider having a facilitator who can help to structure these meetings in a way that they're productive. You see, many stakeholders are uncomfortable talking about risks, and they see such discussions as being negative or pessimistic. And so it may take some expert facilitation skills in order to make these sorts of meetings productive. And now we come to the summary of plan risk management. What do you remember of the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques? Starting with the outputs. There's just one output listed, and that, of course, is the risk management plan. For the inputs, remember that project management is risk management, and that risks affect everything and can come from anywhere. So, the project charter and all of the components or subsidiary plans of the project management plan are inputs to the processes of planning risk management. The stakeholder register is also listed because it specifically includes stakeholder risk appetites and tolerances. And there are some enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets specifically listed. However, keep in mind that these lists are not a complete list of everything that could be inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, and that especially with risk management, risk information could come from just about anywhere. For example, don't the schedule and cost estimates, along with the basis of estimates, tell you something about the uncertainty or risk of a project? So those could be inputs as well. On your list of tools and techniques, you have expert judgment at the top and meetings. These are easy to remember because they're included in virtually every planning process. Data analysis of one form or another is also quite common, and in this case, it's stakeholder analysis. Once you have your risk management plan ready, then the next step is to identify risks. Inputs include virtually all of the components of the project management plan and just about any project documents available, as well as agreements, both internal and external, and any of the many procurement documents. Look anywhere that you can to find assumptions, constraints, uncertainties, ranges of estimates, confidence levels, ambiguity, missing information, stakeholder expectations, attitudes, and tolerances. And you'll want to connect identified risks to your work breakdown structure and requirements traceability matrix, so those are inputs as well. And you also have some enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. As you're identifying risks, see if you can find any published commercial risk databases or checklists of risks, any academic studies or industry studies about similar sorts of projects and their risks, or risks in general, as well as any benchmarking results. Also look into your organization to see what organizational and project process controls you have in place that you should be following, as well as checking for any templates that you should be using, including risk statement formats, and look for checklists from similar projects, as well as any other project files and data and information that you can find in your lessons learned repository. The main outputs of Identify Risks are the risk register and the risk report. At this point, they're really only started, and you'll still need more analysis of other processes for these to be complete. Once you've finished identifying risks, your risk register should include, for each risk identified, an ID, a name, and a description. You might also have some preliminary information on root causes, risk triggers, and warning signs, as well as potential risk owners and risk responses. But don't spend too much time on these just yet, because until you've gone through at least a qualitative risk analysis, you won't have the information you need to properly prioritize each risk, and then, based on the priority, determine more about these root causes, risk owners, and risk responses, as well as the priority level. Contingency reserves, contingency plans and triggers, fallback plans, residual risks, secondary risks, and the watch list. Those all come later. After identifying risks, you'll have very little, if anything, in your risk report. You might have, under the category of overall project risk, some of the sources of overall risk and which are the important drivers of this overall risk. But you won't really have a summary or current status or recommended responses and all of these other factors just yet. An optional part of your risk report is a summary of information on identified individual project risks that will identify, for example, the number of identified threats and opportunities, and have them organized into categories showing that distribution and perhaps some metrics or trends regarding those risks. But this is not a necessary part of your risk report, though it may be for your organization and industry. So if it is, you might have some preliminary information here, but not a lot yet. As you identify risks, remember not only to look broadly in all of the documentation that you have available, but also to look broadly as far as the participation in identifying project risks, and include project team members and risk specialists, customers, subject matter experts, and all kinds of other key stakeholders, including operations managers as well. And also, make sure that when you put this into your risk register, that it has a consistent format that encourages clarity and completeness. Tools and techniques for identifying risks include expert judgment, of course, data gathering techniques such as brainstorming and checklists and interviews, data analysis techniques such as root cause analysis, assumptions analysis, looking at constraints and other documents, as well as doing some SWOT analysis. You'll want to employ some interpersonal and team skills, particularly things like facilitation. And you can also use prompt lists and, of course, meetings. SWOT analysis is simply picking an idea or subject and then identifying the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats related to it. You could do this for your project and the approach you intend to take on your project to help you identify different risks. In summary, your Identify Risks process has two main outputs, the risk register and the risk report, and can also result in updates to some other project documents, such as your assumption log, issue log, and lessons learned register. Your inputs are just about everything that you've already got, including your project management plan and project documents, agreements, and other procurement documentation, and of course, enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. The tools and techniques include expert judgment, different types of data gathering and data analysis, interpersonal and team skills, prompt lists, and meetings. And this concludes Part 1. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.